Paris, May 1992. Behind the closed shutters of a quiet apartment, the body of Marlene Dietrich was found, alone in her bed. The news drifted across continents like a whisper from another age, reminding the world that even stars of eternal glow must fade into silence. Welcome, my wandering listener. Tell me in the comments where you rest as you hear these words, and let us share this circle of memory. Subscribe so the stories continue. Her story begins not with fame, not with scandal, but with the hushed sound of childhood footsteps on cobblestone streets, when Berlin was still a city of contrasts, poised between imperial echoes and modern desires. Marie Magdalene Dietrich was born in 1901 into a household that bore the weight of military tradition and strict order. Her father, a stern officer, embodied the Prussian discipline that had shaped generations before him. Her mother, elegant and careful, tended to the household with a quiet dignity, her gaze often watchful, as though guarding something fragile within her daughters. Marlene, as she would later call herself, was the younger child, more willful, more inclined to drift into daydreams than to follow rules. Even then, a certain restless spark glowed within her, though no one could yet imagine how it would ignite the world. The city into which she was born was alive with paradox. Berlin of the early 20th century was industrious, marching toward modernity, yet haunted by old wars and new uncertainties. There were evenings when the clatter of horse-drawn carriages still echoed, yet overhead electric lights were being strung, illuminating streets that once knew only oil lamps. It was a city of transition, of voices that mingled tradition with rebellion. One can almost imagine a young girl pausing on a street corner, hearing in the distance the solemn tones of a military band, then turning her head to catch the faint laughter spilling from a cafe, where artists gathered in defiance of order. In such a world, Marlene's childhood unfolded. She was not remarkable in the ways her family perhaps hoped. Her schoolwork was sufficient but not dazzling. She was neither fragile nor especially robust, but her gaze was sharp, her eyes a storm gray that could turn quickly from softness to defiance. She loved the violin. Its sound entered her heart as though it had always been waiting there, and she practiced with fervor, fingers aching as she coaxed melodies from the strings. Some whispered she might become a concert violinist. For a time, she believed it herself, for the music offered her a way beyond the boundaries of her household, beyond the stiffness of expectation. Yet even as she played, something restless stirred, something that could not be contained by music alone. When her father died suddenly in her childhood, the household changed. The absence of his authority left a hollow space, yet also a quiet freedom. Still, there was the watchful discipline of her mother, who remarried, seeking stability in uncertain times. Marlene's path was shaped by these dual currents, loss that shadowed her early years and the ever-present weight of propriety. But within her, the seeds of rebellion were already pushing against the soil. Was it inevitable? One wonders that a child so confined would later seek to break every boundary, even at the cost of belonging nowhere? The world beyond her family was shifting as well. Germany in the years before the First World War carried both pride and unease. National fervor was strong, yet beneath it ran a current of fragility, of a society not quite at peace with itself. As the war erupted in 1914, Marlene was just 13, too young to fight, too young to fully understand, yet old enough to feel the weight of a nation's unraveling. Her education was disrupted, her violin studies interrupted, the streets of Berlin filled with uniforms, posters, and whispered rumors of sons who would not return. It was a time that forced even the young into a premature awareness of mortality. Perhaps it was then that she began to weave her sense of identity as armor. She learned early that survival in a turbulent world required masks, performances, and a certain coldness of expression. One can imagine her watching the women of Berlin adapting to wartime scarcity, the children growing silent in hunger and deciding that she, too, must adapt, must fashion herself into something untouchable. The violin, once her tender companion, began to recede. A hand injury, perhaps, or perhaps the realization that her fingers would not carry her to mastery, ended her musical dreams. But in that loss, another path opened, for she was already captivated by the stage, the lights, the way a performer could hold an audience in stillness. In the years after the war, Berlin became a strange place, wounded yet vibrant. The empire had fallen, inflation devoured savings, yet nightclubs and cabarets blossomed like wildflowers on ruins. This duality of despair and decadence became the air Marlene breathed. As a young woman, she began to step onto small stages, still unpolished, her voice untrained, her movements tentative. But even in her hesitancy, there was something that caught the eye, a languid grace, an androgynous tilt of the head, the impression that she belonged to no single category of womanhood. She was not yet the Marlene Dietrich the world would know, but the shadow of that figure was already stretching forward. Her early performances were modest, almost forgettable to some. She took roles in theaters, bit parts in films, walked on and off without leaving deep impressions. Yet here lies the mystery of becoming. For how often is greatness invisible in its own beginnings? How often does a face pass unnoticed until one moment, when suddenly the world cannot look away? If one had seen Marlene then, perhaps she would have seen merely another girl seeking escape from the confines of her upbringing, another face in the dim glow of Berlin's stages. And yet, there was a glimmer. Always a glimmer. It is said that she shortened her name, crafting Marlene from Marie and Magdalene, as though even her identity had to be fashioned anew. Was it a practical choice or a symbolic shedding of childhood? One cannot be certain, but in that act one hears the faint note of defiance, the first stroke in a lifelong painting of reinvention. And so the child who once pressed her fingers against violin strings began to press herself into the mold of performance, shaping an image that would one day shock, seduce, and haunt audiences across the world. Yet here, in this first part of her life, she remains a girl on Berlin's streets, neither famous nor infamous, only restless, listening for a song she had not yet sung. Outside her window, the air carried both the smell of coal smoke and the promise of change. Inside, she practiced expressions before a mirror, learning already how a tilt of the chin or the narrowing of the eyes could suggest secrets. One can almost see her now, leaning closer to that mirror, searching not for who she was, but for who she might become. And perhaps the faintest echo of a violin string still lingered, not in her hands, but in her memory, like a promise broken, yet never forgotten. As night settled over Berlin and lamps flickered against walls marked by history, the girl who would one day be Marlene Dietrich lay awake, dreaming not of violins, not of military fathers, not of school books, but of something nameless, something that glowed just beyond her reach, waiting. And in the stillness of that night, one might imagine the faint sound of violin strings, lingering, unresolved. The violin string lingers in the air, thin and trembling, until it becomes a thread guiding her first steps into the uncertain world of performance. Marlene, no longer a child, stood at the threshold of adulthood in a Berlin that had been scarred by war, yet intoxicated by the sudden freedom of the Weimar Republic. The city had begun to thrum with restless energy, as if determined to dance away the memories of loss. The cafes filled with smoke and chatter, the cabarets flickered with light and daring, and in the small, crowded theaters, the air smelled of sweat, powder, and spilled drink. Here, the young woman who once dreamed of violins began to fashion herself into something new, something not yet defined, a shape still shifting with every night upon the stage. Her first appearances were modest. Small theatrical companies took her in, often only as part of the chorus, her figure lost among others, her voice untrained but not unpleasant. She was learning by imitation, watching the older women, noticing how they moved their hips just so, how they caught the gaze of the audience without letting it hold them too long, how they balanced allure with mystery. It was not yet art, but practice, as if she were tuning herself like the instrument she once abandoned. Those early years did not promise greatness, but within them lay the slow, almost invisible honing of presence. Berlin itself seemed to invite experiment. The rigid empire had collapsed, and in its place came a fragile republic, fragile yet filled with voices demanding expression. Theaters staged bold works, some filled with satire, others with shadows of despair. On the fringes, cabaret halls mocked politics and morality alike, their stages a playground for androgyny, parody, and desire. In such a place, Marlene found herself at home. She had always possessed an ease with ambiguity, a quiet refusal to fit within categories. Though she was still young, her gaze was already slightly aloof, as if she stood apart from herself, watching, calculating. This quality, half detachment and half seduction, would later define her. The thread of the violin stretched now into her voice, for she began to sing. At first, it was uncertain, a voice not technically powerful but husky, shaded, carrying something more than melody. When she sang, it seemed less an act of performance than a glimpse of confession, though the confession was never complete. Listeners could not decide if she meant her words or only played with them, and in that uncertainty lay her charm. Was she mocking love or surrendering to it? Was she sincere or entirely artifice? She herself perhaps did not know, but the ambiguity became her strength. These were years of searching. She tried films as well, small silent roles that left little mark, though one notices, if one looks back, how she already understood the power of stillness on screen. While others exaggerated gestures, she held her face calm, her eyes doing the speaking. The camera, even in its early crude forms, seemed to linger upon her, as though drawn by something it could not name. Yet she remained on the edges of recognition, part of the great swarm of young women seeking escape from ordinary lives. And what did she escape? Perhaps it was the strictness of her mother's expectations, the weight of a home that carried discipline even in mourning. Perhaps it was the memory of a father's absence, a void that no one could fill. Or perhaps it was simply the hunger to become more than herself, to shape a new identity from fragments of old. Whatever the cause, she moved steadily toward the stage lights, though the path was strewn with uncertainty. Berlin in the 1920s offered both opportunity and danger. Inflation devastated households, money lost its value overnight, yet in the nightclubs one could find champagne flowing as if nothing had changed. For the young performers, survival depended not only on talent, but also on connections, on the willingness to please directors, patrons, lovers. Marlene was no stranger to this reality. Rumors suggested she charmed her way into certain roles, though what is charm but another form of skill? To dismiss such maneuvers is to ignore the truth of performance itself, for is not the whole stage built upon seduction of the gaze? She was still unshaped, yet in moments the outline of what she would become revealed itself. When she stood in a certain light, her face half-shadowed, the masculine cut of a tailored jacket over her frame, audiences stirred. There was something daring in her refusal to be only feminine, something unsettling in her suggestion that identity itself was fluid. She may not have intended revolution, yet by merely embodying her own restlessness, she hinted at it. And so the young woman, Once a student of violin, now rehearsed nightly in cramped back rooms, her costumes cheap, her future uncertain. Each evening the flicker of the stage light beckoned, and each evening she stepped forward, slowly learning how to hold herself, how to pause before delivering a line, how to tilt her head so the shadow fell across her cheek. These were lessons not of school but of instinct, sharpened by failure, refined by repetition. How many times did she return home late, her shoes worn, her spirits uneven, wondering if the path she had chosen was folly? Yet she did not turn away. The air of Berlin carried both smoke and promise, and in that promise she planted herself. She was not yet Lola Lola, not yet the icon draped in feathers, not yet the exile who would sing for soldiers at war. She was only a girl standing beneath dim lights, rehearsing again and again, each note a thread woven into the larger fabric of her becoming. If one could step into that moment, sit in the back row of a smoky theater and watch her, one might not know the future, yet one might feel something. Not brilliance, not perfection, but a suggestion of mystery, a faint pull that draws the eye again and again. This is how it begins, quietly, uncertainly, in places no one remembers, under lights that flicker. And as another performance ended, as the audience clapped politely, as the players stepped off stage into the hum of ordinary chatter, a single stage light flickered above, burning unevenly, neither steady nor extinguished, a fragile glow holding against the darkness. The flickering stage light wavered as if uncertain whether to hold its glow or surrender to the shadows. And from that fragile shimmer, her face emerged, lit in ways even she could not fully command. The transition from the stage to the silent screen was not immediate nor certain, but in those years of restless Berlin, where artists and dreamers collided nightly, the young woman who now called herself Marlene found herself drifting into film. Silent cinema was still an experiment then, fragile and strange, its images dancing without voice, its gestures magnified, its dramas unfolding in exaggerated silence. To many it seemed a curious spectacle, fleeting entertainment rather than art. Yet for Marlene, it became a mirror through which her enigmatic presence could be glimpsed. She was not yet a star. Her roles were minor, walk-ons, faces in a crowd, glimpses that might vanish if one blinked too soon. But the camera, that tireless observer, seemed unwilling to let her pass unnoticed. There was something in her stillness, something in the way her eyes held the lens without fear, that made her linger beyond the script's demands. Unlike others who flailed their arms in theatrical exaggeration, Marlene seemed to understand instinctively that the camera required less, not more. A tilt of the chin, the narrowing of her gaze, and already a story was being told. She did not yet know it, but the screen was teaching her how to be seen, how to speak without words. Berlin of the 1920s was itself a kind of silent film, flickering between decadence and despair. Inflation devoured fortunes overnight. The mark was worth less with each passing week, and housewives carried bundles of notes only to purchase bread. Yet in the cabarets, champagne still flowed, laughter rang out, and the city seemed determined to live in defiance of its own fragility. Theaters pushed boundaries with daring plays. Painters splashed colors in rebellion against old orders, and musicians improvised in smoky rooms until dawn. It was a city unsettled, alive with contradictions, a city where one could reinvent oneself nightly. And within this turbulence, Marlene began to experiment with herself. She tried on roles not only in films, but in life. She wore men's jackets with careless elegance, allowing whispers to follow her into the streets. She allowed her hair to fall one evening in soft waves, the next to be slicked back with masculine severity. Her lovers shifted as quickly as her costumes, for she was discovering the fluidity of desire, how boundaries of gender and convention dissolved under the heat of intimacy. Berlin was a city that permitted such experiments, or at least tolerated them in its shadows, and Marlene thrived in the ambiguity. If she could not master the violin, she would master the art of being seen. Yet even as she moved through these small films and cabaret stages, her path was uncertain. Many who began in such places vanished, their names lost to playbills that crumbled, their faces forgotten. What kept her from that same fate? Perhaps it was luck, perhaps a stubbornness of spirit, or perhaps it was the way she carried mystery even when nothing around her suggested significance. She did not explain herself, did not offer clarity, and so others filled the silence with fascination. Was she mocking them or seducing them? Was she strong or fragile? Was she sincere or only ever pretending? The answers never came, and so the questions deepened. Silent films suited her in this way. She need not speak. She need only appear, and in appearance lay her power. One remembers how in certain reels she passed briefly across the frame, and yet the eye followed her rather than the protagonist. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, not soft nor simple, but striking, with angles that resisted easy admiration. Beauty fades into familiarity, but strangeness lingers, and Marlene was strange in just the right measure. Still, the city itself was restless, and the shadow of its turbulence seeped into her. Behind the laughter of Berlin's cabarets, behind the smoke and applause, lay hunger, despair, and the fragile structure of a nation not yet healed. Perhaps that is why she carried within her both allure and melancholy, as if she could never fully belong to the lights, nor retreat into the shadows. She lived in between, and that is where the eye lingered. Her colleagues sometimes doubted her future. They said she lacked discipline, that her ambitions were vague, that she cared more for appearances than for the craft itself. And yet appearances can become a craft, and she was shaping hers slowly, instinctively. Even then, the seed of her later transformation was present, hidden beneath uncertainty. To craft oneself is a long process, requiring failures that are later forgotten. In the cabaret halls, the air thick with smoke and laughter, she tested her presence. One evening she would appear in a sequined gown, her voice a husky whisper sliding through the melody. The next she would step out in a man's tuxedo, hair slicked, cigarette between her fingers, her smile daring the audience to look away. These performances were not yet legendary, but they were practice for a greater role, the rehearsal of an identity not yet named. How many nights did she return home with her spirit unsettled, wondering whether she had found her place or only drifted further from it? One can imagine her standing before a mirror once more, wiping away rouge, loosening her collar, searching her own reflection for answers. Did she know then that she would become the embodiment of an era's contradictions? Or was she simply another restless soul in Berlin, seeking escape through disguise? The years moved quietly, carrying her from one small role to another, until at last the whispers of recognition began. A director noticed her, then another, remarking on how the camera seemed unable to ignore her. She was no longer only a face among many, she was a presence, not yet commanding but undeniably magnetic. And so the young woman who once clutched a violin now clutched at something else, the fragile promise of cinema, the faint suggestion that her path was opening. Berlin itself seemed to mirror her. It was alive with experimentation, yet its foundations trembled. Politics darkened, inflation grew monstrous, yet in the night the city dressed itself in feathers and sequins, laughing as though tomorrow might never come. Marlene belonged to this city of masks and contradictions, this city where every face held both tragedy and rebellion. She was both of it and apart from it, a participant and an observer, her gaze always just slightly detached, as if guarding a secret. And so the flicker of the stage light became the flicker of film, and her face, though still unknown to most, began to appear again and again, caught by the camera, drawn into stories that were never hers, but that nonetheless bore her trace. The laughter of the cabaret halls followed her, echoing faintly, a reminder that performance is both mask and revelation, that truth and illusion dance together upon the same floor. And on a certain evening, in the dim haze of a Berlin club, laughter erupted suddenly, sharp and unrestrained, spilling into the air like a challenge. It lingered, unresolved, neither joyous nor cruel, but unsettling, as if the city itself were laughing through her. The laughter lingered, sharp and unrestrained, until it softened into the echo of cabaret halls, where smoke curled upward and glasses clinked against wood. Out of that laughter emerged the moment that would define her, the role that would carry her beyond Berlin's restless nights and into the gaze of the entire world. The film was Der blaue Engel, the Blue Angel, released in 1930, and in it Marlene became Lola Lola, the cabaret singer who lured a respectable professor into ruin with the sway of her hips and the husky drawl of her voice. It was more than a role, it was a mirror in which her own essence seemed to glimmer. The director, Josef von Sternberg, saw in her something others had only half noticed. Where others dismissed her as a chorus girl with striking eyes, he recognized the strange power of her ambiguity. He placed her beneath the light with precision, let the camera dwell on her half-smile, her deliberate stillness, her way of letting the audience come to her rather than rushing toward them. She did not need to perform with wild gestures. She needed only to exist in front of the lens, and already the air thickened with suggestion. Under Sternberg's gaze, she was transformed, yet perhaps she also transformed him, for he too became captivated, entwined in a collaboration that was both creative and consuming. The Blue Angel was more than a story of seduction and downfall. It was a parable of a changing world. The old order, symbolized by the professor in his stiff uniform of respectability, was undone by the allure of the new, embodied in Lola Lola's reckless sensuality. Germany itself was trembling in the same tension, the stern traditions of the past colliding with the unruly freedoms of the Weimar era. Marlene, through Lola, became the face of this collision. Her androgynous charm, her cigarette smoke, her laughter that hovered between cruelty and tenderness, all captured the spirit of a society unsure whether it was descending into chaos or awakening into freedom. She did not only play Lola, she seemed to inhabit her. When she sat on the barrel in her black stockings, when she sang with that husky voice, there was no line between actress and character. Was Marlene merely performing, or was she revealing something of herself? The answer is as elusive as her gaze. Perhaps that is why the role struck so deeply. Audiences were unsettled because they could not tell where fiction ended and truth began. The feathers of her costume drifted across the stage, the sequins shimmered, and the world leaned closer. She was no longer simply a German actress of minor roles. She was a symbol, an icon of allure and danger. In that performance, she crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. She became not only famous but mythic, as if Lola Lola had claimed Marlene Dietrich as much as Marlene had claimed her. The success of the Blue Angel rippled outward. It carried her across oceans, into Hollywood, where Paramount saw in her the chance to fashion a new star for the world. Yet before she boarded ships, before the glamour of California, there was still Berlin, still the sense of a city that had both made her and rejected her. Some adored her boldness, others dismissed her as indecent, too provocative, too strange. But she no longer belonged to them alone. She had become a figure of international fascination. Her collaboration with von Sternberg continued, and together they created a series of films that would define her image. Yet it all began here, with the feathers drifting, with the barrel on stage, with a song that seemed half laughter, half lament. And one wonders, did she feel triumph, or did she feel the first stirrings of exile? For in becoming Lola Lola, she became something larger than herself, and once a figure steps into myth, there is no simple return to the ordinary. The film itself was shot with a precision that mirrored her transformation. Sternberg placed lights to sculpt her face into shadows and brilliance. He insisted on costumes that suggested both exposure and concealment. He knew that her power lay not in what was shown, but in what was withheld. Audiences felt they saw everything, yet always suspected there was something just out of reach, something she concealed in silence. This was the essence of her allure, not the revelation of truth, but the promise of secrets never fully told. Outside the cinema, the world itself was trembling. The crash of 1929 had shaken economies, and Germany, fragile already, slid toward despair. Yet here was this film, decadent, daring, speaking of ruin and desire, and audiences could not turn away. Perhaps they saw in it a reflection of their own uncertainty. Perhaps they envied the professor's fall, for in his surrender to Lola's allure, there was both tragedy and freedom. Marlene's voice lingered in their ears. Falling in love again, never wanted to. What am I to do? It was a confession and a challenge at once, a line that seemed to mock the idea of control itself. And so, the image of Marlene Dietrich, draped in feathers, cigarette in hand, eyes both mocking and wounded, entered the world's imagination. From that moment, she was no longer simply a woman, nor even an actress, but a symbol of the dangerous edge between desire and destruction. She had stepped into a role that would follow her for life, whether she embraced it or fled from it. Was it triumph, or was it entrapment? Could one ever leave behind the mask of Lola once it had been worn so completely? In her later years, Marlene would speak of the burdens of this fame, of how she became prisoner to her own image. But in that first moment, in the shimmer of sequins and the laughter that cut like glass, she seemed untouchable, eternal. And as the final scene of the film faded, as the professor's dignity collapsed in ruin, a feather drifted silently from Lola's costume, floating downward, light as breath, landing without sound, unresolved, as if the story had not ended at all, but only begun. The feather drifted silently downward, carrying with it the suggestion of endings, yet instead it became a vessel for beginnings. Across the ocean, it seemed to float, light and unburdened, until it landed among the dazzling lights of Hollywood, where the dream factories of Paramount awaited with their promises and their traps. In 1930, Marlene Dietrich, now unmistakably transformed by her performance in The Blue Angel, was summoned to America, that distant land where cinema had already become an empire. She boarded a ship, leaving behind Berlin's smoke-filled cabarets, its laughter and despair, and sailed toward a world where her image would be polished until it gleamed like glass. Hollywood at that time was both feverish and insecure. The great studios ruled with heavy hands, sculpting actors into stars, dictating their appearances, their gestures, their very words. Glamour was crafted like machinery, every angle rehearsed, every costume designed to project an ideal. Into this realm stepped Marlene, an outsider, still uncertain in English, still carrying the shadows of Berlin upon her. Yet it was precisely this foreignness, this aura of distance, that Paramount sought to mold into an exotic treasure. They paired her again with Joseph von Sternberg, the director who had revealed her in The Blue Angel. Together, they began a series of films that would define not only her career, but her image in the imagination of the world. The first was Morocco in 1930, And it was here, beneath the intense heat of the studio lamps, that the legend of Marlene Dietrich in Hollywood was born. Morocco presented her as Amy Jolly, a cabaret singer in North Africa, whose androgynous performance stunned audiences. Dressed in a tuxedo, she sang to a crowd, her voice low, her movements deliberate, and in a moment now etched into cinematic memory, she bent forward and kissed another woman upon the lips. It was daring, scandalous, and entirely unforgettable. In an industry that prided itself on glamour yet feared controversy, this image stood out as both transgressive and magnetic. Audiences gasped, yet they did not turn away. Instead, they leaned closer. Who was this woman who defied convention with such casual elegance? It was not simply the act of the kiss, nor the tuxedo, but the way she carried it. As if she were entirely at ease within contradiction, as if she belonged to no single definition. In that scene, she became more than a performer. She became a possibility, a suggestion that identity itself could be worn and discarded like costume, that desire could cross lines without apology. And in doing so, she unsettled Hollywood's rigid codes, even as she enriched its glamour. Sternberg's camera adored her. He sculpted her with light, casting her face into shadows that seemed to reveal more than brightness ever could. He placed jewels and veils upon her, then stripped them away with a shift of the lens. Together, they crafted an image that was never complete, always elusive. Each film added to the myth. Dishonored, Shanghai Express, Blonde Venus. In each, she was both distant and intimate, mocking and vulnerable, a woman whose gaze could undo men, yet who seemed untouched herself. But beneath the bright lamps of the studio, something else stirred. Fame brought luxury, yet it also brought confinement. Paramount controlled her contracts, arranged her publicity, molded her into a figure of exotic otherness. She became the foreign star, the mysterious European whose accent alone suggested sophistication. And yet, was she not also a prisoner of this image? Could she laugh freely, stumble, age, without betraying the illusion? The burning studio lamps bore down on her, hot and relentless. Filming under Sternberg was no easy task. He was meticulous, demanding, obsessed with perfection. Scenes were rehearsed endlessly, lights adjusted until hours had passed, costumes altered until they shimmered with a calculated degree of temptation. For Marlene, this was both ordeal and opportunity. She surrendered to his vision, knowing it shaped her own. But surrender is never without cost. How much of herself did she lose in becoming his creation? And how much did she gain becoming herself through the gaze of another? Audiences adored her. Letters poured in, men confessed infatuations, women found in her an unsettling mirror of their own unspoken desires. She was admired, desired, envied, and judged. For each who saw her as a goddess, there were others who dismissed her as scandalous, indecent, too strange to embody the warmth Hollywood preferred. Yet she remained, her star rising higher with each release, her face more etched into memory. Her accent, once a barrier, became part of her allure. In an age when many actresses were reshaped into American ideals, she retained the cadence of Europe, the husky drawl that carried both seduction and irony. In her refusal to erase her foreignness, she stood apart, an outsider who nonetheless reigned at the center of the screen. But Hollywood's embrace was never gentle. It praised and devoured in equal measure. Each new film required reinvention, yet reinvention always circled back to the same mystery: the woman who revealed and concealed at once. Was she victim or temptress, faithful or faithless, real or unreal? The studio did not care to answer, for it was the unanswered question that sold tickets. And so, beneath the bright lamps, Marlene Dietrich became not simply a performer, but an icon of ambiguity. She crossed oceans not only in distance, but in identity. shedding Berlin yet never fully belonging to America, embracing glamour yet mocking it with her arched brows, her ironic smile. She was inside the machine of Hollywood, yet always slightly beyond its grasp, as though her true self remained elsewhere, hidden in shadows. At night, when the filming was done and the costumes hung in silence, one wonders what she thought as she removed her makeup before the mirror. Did she see Lola staring back, or Amy Jolly, or some version of herself that no one else could name? Was the image in the glass hers, or Sternberg's creation, or a blend of both? Perhaps she did not ask, for to question too deeply might shatter the spell. The feather that drifted from her costume in Berlin had now landed beneath the blazing heat of Paramount's lamps, yet still it carried the same fragility. Fame is light as a feather, easily lifted, easily lost. And in that fragile balance, Marlene began to live the paradox of her life, adored yet alone, powerful yet dependent, radiant yet shadowed. The lamp burned hotter, the glow around her sharper, until the heat itself seemed to threaten combustion. And in that heat, as the cameras rolled and the audience leaned ever closer, a single thought lingered in the smoke of the studio. How long can a flame burn before it begins to consume? The lamp burned hotter, the glow sharpening the outline of her face until it seemed almost unreal. And when the filming ended and the light was switched off, the air still carried the warmth of its heat. It lingered, heavy and close, as though refusing to release her from its grasp. From that warmth rose another kind of fire, one not cast by studio lamps but by the unceasing blaze of her desires, her entanglements, her lovers who came and went like shadows. For Marlene Dietrich, life off-screen was no less daring than the roles she inhabited, and perhaps it was here that scandal truly attached itself to her name. Hollywood was a land of whispered affairs, of headlines crafted by studio hands, of secrets kept in the dim corners of restaurants. Yet Marlene's passions could not be entirely hidden. She loved freely, recklessly, both men and women, never confined by the boundaries that society sought to impose. Her lovers were writers, actors, artists, and strangers caught in her orbit for a brief time before slipping away. Some left her with devotion, others with bitterness, but all left altered. For to love Marlene was to enter into a storm of allure and distance. The men were many, names both famous and fleeting. Gary Cooper, whose rugged charm mirrored the American myth, found himself captivated by her cool seduction. John Gilbert, once a great silent star, fell into her arms as his career faltered. Eric Maria Remarque, author of All Quiet on the Western Front, carried his own scars of war, and in her he found both solace and torment. Each relationship became a chapter, brief yet intense, a performance of intimacy as complicated as any script. And then there were the women, whose presence in her life was whispered more carefully in that cautious age, yet whose significance cannot be diminished. Edith Piaf, the Sparrow of France, whose voice trembled with heartbreak, shared nights of intimacy with Marlene that left each marked by the other's fire. Mercedes D'Acosta, playwright and lover of Greta Garbo, was drawn too into Marlene's embrace, though perhaps never fully secure within it. These affairs, both tender and fierce, revealed a truth she never cared to conceal, that desire for her was not bound by gender, but by the intensity of connection, by the thrill of surrender and control. It was this freedom that scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. To her audience, she was the exotic temptress on screen. To those who knew her, she was the same in life, unashamed, unapologetic. Yet freedom carries its own loneliness. For how can one belong to another when one belongs so completely to oneself? Lovers entered her life, but few remained. She burned brightly for them, then moved onward, perhaps in search of something she could never quite name. Did she long for constancy, or did she fear it? Did she seek in each affair the answer to some unspoken question, or was the search itself her only desire? The studios, ever cautious of scandal, sometimes sought to shape her reputation, but she was not easily managed. She cultivated her own myth with as much care as Sternberg lit her face on film. She allowed rumors to spread, even encouraged them, for mystery was her greatest weapon. And yet, behind the glamour, there was solitude. The nights were not always filled with champagne and laughter. There were evenings when the applause had faded, when the lovers had gone, when she sat alone in her home, the cigarette burning in an ashtray beside her, its smoke curling upward in silence. The ashtray became a witness to her solitude, filled with the remnants of cigarettes smoked in restless thought. She was never truly abandoned, for her fame drew admirers endlessly. Yet presence is not the same as intimacy. She once confessed that she was always surrounded yet always alone, a paradox of the star who belongs to everyone and to no one. Perhaps that is why she clung to affairs so fiercely when they came, as though each might momentarily break the solitude, even if only for a night. Her daughter, Maria Riva, would later write of these contradictions, of a mother both dazzling and distant, a woman whose passions consumed her, yet left others sometimes scorched in their wake. The child's presence in Marlene's life was undeniable, yet the demands of stardom, of reinvention, of lovers and roles often overshadowed the quiet needs of family. In her pursuit of freedom, she paid a cost not always acknowledged in the glow of fame. Still, Marlene seemed unrepentant. She spoke of love as though it were a current to be followed, not resisted. If scandal followed, so be it. If judgment came, let it. For her, to deny desire was a greater sin than to indulge it. In this, she stood apart from her contemporaries, many of whom concealed their truths beneath layers of Hollywood's expectations. She lived them openly, and in doing so became not only scandalous, but revolutionary. A figure whose life itself was a kind of performance, daring the world to look away. And yet, beneath it all, one senses the ache of something unresolved. Was her freedom a triumph, or was it also a mask? Did she seek in others what she could never find within herself, or was the seeking itself her only peace? The cigarette glowed faintly in the ashtray, its ember burning down to ash, and in that glow lies the image of a woman, both triumphant and tragic, liberated and lonely, radiant and haunted. The smoke lingered, curling through the room, carrying with it both the scent of passion and the silence of solitude. It rose higher, thinning, fading into the air, until only the faint warmth of the ashtray remained, unresolved, waiting. The warmth of the ashtray lingered, its faint glow dissolving into shadow, and in that half-light, another kind of smoke began to rise, thicker, darker, filling the skies above Europe. It was the fog of war, creeping over cities that had once sung with laughter, swallowing streets in fear and silence. In those years when the world slid once again toward violence, Marlene Dietrich faced choices that would set her apart from her homeland forever. Choices that revealed not merely the scandal of her loves, but the depth of her convictions. The Germany she had left behind still echoed within her. Berlin's cabarets, its strange mixture of decadence and despair, had shaped her into the woman she became. But as the 1930s unfolded, the city hardened under the march of uniforms and banners, under the voices of men who shouted of purity and power. The rising tide of National Socialism offered her a place, if she wished it. The Nazis admired her beauty, her fame, her ability to sway hearts with a glance. Invitations were extended, promises made that she could reign as Germany's great star if only she returned, if only she lent her voice to their cause. She refused. Firmly, without hesitation, she turned away from the homeland that sought to reclaim her. For Marlene, glamour meant nothing if shackled to tyranny. She had seen the early stirrings of brutality in Berlin, she had sensed the narrowing of freedom, and she would not return to adorn its banners. Instead, she applied for American citizenship, taking upon herself the mantle of exile. To renounce one's homeland is never a simple act. It wounds, it divides, it leaves scars that never quite heal. Yet she chose this path, and in choosing she became both heroine and traitor, depending on whose eyes judged her. Exile is a heavy garment. It may glitter in the light of Hollywood, but it weighs heavy in the quiet of the night. For though she was adored in America, though her films sparkled across screens worldwide, she was cut off from the soil of her childhood, the streets where she first played her violin, the city that had formed her contradictions. To belong nowhere is both freedom and burden, and Marlene carried it with an elegance that concealed the ache within. As the war deepened, she did more than refuse the Nazi call. She became an active voice against them, raising funds, speaking out, offering herself not merely as a star, but as a soldier of morale. She joined the United Service Organizations, traveling to entertain Allied troops, her voice carried into tents and fields, into places where young men waited with fear in their eyes. She sang for them, not as Lola Lola now, but as Marlene, the exile, the woman who had turned her back on the power that might have exalted her. Her performances at the front lines became legendary, the image of her in uniform trousers and tailored jackets, standing beneath canvas tents, smoke curling around her, singing with that low, husky tone that seemed to carry both promise and lament. The soldiers adored her. She became their angel of defiance, their reminder of life beyond the mud and danger. She kissed cheeks, told jokes, sang lullabies of a homeland many would never see again. And yet behind the tenderness was steel, a woman who had chosen a side and risked her safety to stand upon it. She could have remained in Hollywood, distant and untouched, but instead she went where the danger lived, walking into the dust and fatigue of war zones. Why did she do it? Was it guilt for leaving her homeland? A need to prove her loyalty to her adopted country? Or was it simply conviction, the fierce refusal to stand silent while tyranny spoke? The answer, as with much in her life, is elusive. But the choice itself remains undeniable. For this, she was adored abroad and reviled at home. In Germany, her name became cursed. She was seen as betrayer, as traitor, the woman who had rejected her people to side with the enemy. For years after the war, this wound would remain unhealed, cutting her off from reconciliation with her homeland. To exile oneself is to carry such estrangement always, and Marlene bore it with stoic grace. Yet one imagines the private pain of hearing her own people spit her name with anger, the same people for whom she once sang in Berlin's smoky halls. Exile, war, rejection, these did not dim her resolve. She continued, moving from camp to camp, offering her songs, her laughter, her enigmatic presence. Soldiers remembered her decades later, not simply for the glamour she embodied, but for the sense of humanity she carried into the trenches. In their memories, she was not the distant star of Paramount, but the woman who stood among them. Dust on her boots, eyes weary but kind. The boots of marching armies echoed across Europe, heavy, relentless. Marlene stood against that echo, her voice a counterpoint, fragile yet defiant. And when the war ended, she was honored for her service by America, by France receiving medals for her courage. She accepted them quietly with dignity, yet perhaps also with the knowledge that the cost of such honor was estrangement from the soil of her birth. And so, from the warmth of the cigarette ashtray to the fog of war, her path carried her into exile, into a choice that defined her not only as an actress, but as a woman of conviction. She was no longer only Lola, nor only the exotic star of Hollywood. She was the exile who sang against tyranny, the woman who stood apart from her homeland, the figure whose voice carried both the glamour of cinema and the defiance of conscience. The sound of marching boots receded at last, fading into silence as the war drew to its close. Yet their echo lingered, unresolved, as if the rhythm of those boots would never entirely depart from her memory, nor from ours. The boots faded, their heavy rhythm dissolving into silence, and in that silence arose another sound, softer but no less insistent. The murmur of soldiers resting after long marches, the low hum of men too weary to speak, the clatter of mess tins, the coughs in the cold night air. Into that weary stillness came Marlene, her voice and presence threading themselves among the worn bodies like a strange kind of balm. She did not carry rifles nor command troops, yet her contribution was measured in another currency, one of spirit and endurance. For in the war years, Dietrich became more than actress or exile. She became a figure of resilience, her voice rising from the dust to remind men that life was more than fear, that beauty and tenderness could still exist even in the shadow of death. She toured relentlessly, not in the comfort of Hollywood, but in tents, pitched near the front, in hospitals heavy with the smell of iodine, in makeshift stages built from wooden crates. The conditions were often harsh, cold that bit into her skin, dust that choked her throat, long nights of travel on rough roads, yet she endured it all, dressed not in gowns but in simple trousers, boots, and military jackets that she wore with as much elegance as any evening dress. To the soldiers she appeared both glamorous and approachable, a reminder of the world they fought to preserve. Her songs were not thunderous performances, but intimate offerings. She would sit with a cigarette between her fingers, her voice low and smoky, the words drifting like confidences rather than declarations. Lili Marleen became her anthem in those days, a song of longing and distance, of a soldier dreaming of the one he left behind. Though the song itself predated her, Marlene's rendition carried the weight of truth. It was sung in both German and English, crossing the lines of enemy and ally, reminding all who heard it that longing is a universal ache. Some say the song was played on radios for soldiers on both sides, its melody weaving across battle lines as though war itself could not silence it. What must it have felt like? To be in a tent of weary men, mud still on their boots, fear still in their eyes, and hear that voice husky and tender, carrying a melody that spoke of love and memory? Some remembered it as the moment when the war felt distant, if only for a breath. For a few minutes the chaos dissolved, and they were simply human again, dreaming of home, of warmth, of touch. But Marlene gave more than songs. She walked among the soldiers, speaking to them, listening, holding hands, laughing at their jokes, allowing them to see not the untouchable star, but a woman willing to share their fatigue. Photographs remain of her kneeling in the mud to sign autographs, of her perched on tanks, of her laughing with men who would soon march back into danger. These were not staged images alone. They were glimpses of her insistence that presence mattered, that to show up where the fear lived was itself an act of defiance. There were dangers, too. Touring so close to the front lines meant exposure to air raids, to sudden violence. She accepted this risk with a stoicism that surprised those around her. Perhaps for the woman who had already exiled herself, who had already chosen conviction over safety, the danger was simply another cost to be borne. Or perhaps there was in her a deeper need to prove to herself as much as to others that she belonged to this struggle, that her rejection of Nazi Germany was not merely symbolic, but embodied. Her fellow entertainers remembered her as tireless, though her body paid the price. The dust and smoke strained her throat, the endless travel wore her down, and yet she pressed on. To stop would have felt like betrayal. She knew that the soldiers clung to her visits, that for some, seeing Marlene Dietrich sing in a dim tent became a memory carried through the darkest nights. And so she gave again and again, until her very image became inseparable from the war itself. A strange angel clad in trousers and boots, her voice soft yet defiant. And yet always there was contradiction. To the Americans and French, she was adored, honored with medals, celebrated as proof that art could serve freedom. To many Germans, she remained a figure of bitterness, the woman who abandoned them, who sang for their enemies. This division followed her, and perhaps it haunted her more than she ever admitted. For can one ever sever oneself entirely from the land of one's birth? Was there not, beneath her iron refusal, a secret ache for reconciliation? Still, she pressed forward. Her songs, her laughter, her presence at the front, all carried the same message, that humanity was not erased by war, that tenderness could persist amid destruction. Perhaps that was her greatest gift, greater even than the roles she played on screen, to embody the persistence of humanity where it seemed most fragile. And in the dust of those camps, in the silence after her songs, when soldiers drifted back to their cots with eyes still glimmering from the memory of her voice, one imagines the taste of dust lingering on the air, dry and bitter, unresolved, clinging to the throat like a reminder that beauty and sorrow can never be fully separated. The taste of dust lingered, bitter on the tongue, clinging in the throat, even after the guns fell silent and the flags of victory were raised. The war had ended, but endings are never clean, and for Marlene Dietrich, peace carried its own sorrows. She had given her songs, her laughter, her presence to soldiers in the darkest of hours, and for this, America and France showered her with honors. Medals glinted against her breast, symbols of gratitude from nations that called her courageous, an artist who had chosen the path of conviction. Abroad she was embraced, feted as one who had stood against tyranny with the only weapons she possessed, her voice, her will, her refusal to yield. Yet the land of her birth did not receive her with open arms. In Germany, the streets where she once walked, the theaters where she once rehearsed, the cabarets where her early voice trembled with inexperience, had become places that muttered her name as if it were poison. For many Germans, she was not heroine but traitor, the woman who abandoned them in their hour of humiliation, who turned her art against the homeland in its most desperate days. Her exile, her citizenship in America, her presence among Allied troops, all these made her an outcast in the eyes of those who survived amid ruins. When she returned for concerts in post-war Europe, she was greeted with a mixture of adoration and venom. Paris received her like a queen. Crowds gathered, enchanted once again by the shimmer of her gowns, by the low husk of her voice, by the enigma she carried even in middle age. London, New York, Rome, all embraced her as though the war had only deepened her legend. The applause rose in waves, washing over her, confirming that she remained a star even in a world that had been shattered and rebuilt. Yet when she stepped onto stages in Germany, she heard not only applause but hisses, jeers, the spit of those who could not forgive her betrayal. To them, she was no daughter of Berlin but a woman who had cast her homeland aside. The contrast was stark. Abroad, flowers were thrown at her feet. At home, insults. How must it have felt to stand before an audience of her own countrymen, to sing in her native tongue, and to see faces twisted in anger? Did she feel sorrow, regret, or only the coldness of one who had already severed ties? Some say tears welled in her eyes at those performances, hidden behind lashes and powder, quickly concealed by the mask she had perfected. Others insist she held her chin higher, letting defiance shield her from their scorn. Whatever the truth, she carried both wounds and laurels, two opposing verdicts inscribed upon her life. The post-war concerts themselves became events of spectacle and reflection. Dressed in gowns shimmering with sequins, cloaked in furs, she would step slowly into the light, her figure tall and commanding, and the room would fall into silence. Her voice, though never technically flawless, was heavy with experience, every note colored by memory. She sang not like the young Lola Lola, but like one who had walked through exile, who had seen war, who had lived among contradictions. Audiences leaned in, listening less to her technique than to the atmosphere she conjured, the sense that her very presence was the song. Her repertoire was carefully chosen, ballads of longing, songs of heartbreak, melodies of irony and laughter mingled. Each performance was not merely entertainment, but an act of survival, a reminder to herself and others that she remained alive, radiant, unbroken. Yet beneath the sequins and lights, solitude shadowed her. Applause is intoxicating but fleeting. When the last notes faded and the stage emptied, she returned to her dressing room, where silence waited like an old companion. The mirror reflected her face, powdered, painted, lit by bulbs that hummed faintly, and in that reflection she may have seen both triumph and tragedy. Germany's rejection haunted her for years. Though she continued to tour internationally, though she filled halls from Paris to Tokyo, the wound of estrangement never fully healed. She spoke of it at times with bitterness, at other times with resignation. She had chosen, and choices bear consequences. Yet one wonders whether in the quiet of night she longed for reconciliation, for a return to the streets of her youth without fear of condemnation. Perhaps she dreamed of Berlin not as it was, but as it might have been, a city that could embrace both her rebellion and her loyalty, a city that could forgive. But history does not offer such easy reconciliations. She remained divided, her life a testament to the cost of conviction. Abroad she was celebrated, her concerts a glittering procession of glamour and memory. At home she was cursed, her name a reminder of betrayal. Few figures have lived so completely in paradox, adored and reviled in equal measure. Perhaps this was her fate from the beginning, for had she not always lived between categories, neither fully one thing nor another, always ambiguous, always elusive. In one photograph from this period, she sits after a performance, her gown still shimmering, a glass of wine on the table before her. The room is empty of applause, the flowers left behind on the floor, petals beginning to wilt. She gazes at the glass, her expression unreadable, as though listening to a sound no one else can hear. Perhaps it is the applause echoing in her ears, or perhaps it is the memory of hisses and jeers, or perhaps it is silence itself, the only constant in a life of noise. And when she lifted that glass to her lips, one imagines the taste of wine mingling with something more bitter, like the dust of war still lingering, like the echo of voices that refuse to forgive. The glass was emptied, set down upon the table, its rim still damp with her touch, waiting in the quiet after music. The glass stood upon the table, its rim damp, the last trace of wine catching the faint light of the dressing room before fading into shadow. Around it, silence gathered, heavy and unyielding. She reached for the mirror, leaned close and breathed, and upon the glass a soft fog bloomed, veiling her reflection. It was there, in the quiet space between applause and solitude, that Marlene Dietrich entered the next chapter of her life. The struggle against time, the endless work of reinvention, the refusal to surrender to age in an industry that worshipped youth. By the mid-century, she was no longer the young Lola Lola who had perched upon a barrel, stockings gleaming under stage lights, nor the tuxedoed siren who had scandalized audiences in Morocco. Time had touched her face, gently at first, then with a firmer hand. The lines of laughter, of sorrow, of sleepless nights began to etch themselves into her skin. Hollywood, relentless in its hunger for freshness, whispered of new stars, younger faces, brighter promises. For many actresses, this was the quiet end, the fading into supporting roles or disappearance altogether. But Marlene was not willing to fade. She resisted the passing years with the same defiance with which she had resisted convention, scandal, and exile. Cosmetic surgery became her secret ally, though never fully hidden. She sought to preserve the illusion, to hold on to the image that had captivated audiences. Surgeons' knives traced her skin, pulled and stitched, remade her features into something closer to the eternal youth demanded by the screen. Yet surgery could not halt time entirely. It could only mask, only delay. Beneath the makeup, beneath the careful hair, beneath the gowns that concealed as much as they revealed, age advanced still. But perhaps for her, the act of resisting mattered more than the result. To give up would have been a greater wound than any scar left by the surgeon's hand. Her reinvention extended beyond her body. She crafted her image with meticulous care, each appearance designed, each gesture rehearsed. Photographers were controlled, lenses angled, lights arranged to flatter, to preserve the illusion of ageless allure. She knew the power of the image, and she refused to allow it to slip from her grasp. In photographs of these years, one sees a woman radiant still, but also guarded, as though behind the shimmer of sequins and fur stood a fortress built to keep despair at bay. The stage became her sanctuary once more. Films offered fewer roles, but concerts remained, and in them she found both reinvention and survival. She stepped onto stages draped in gowns that glittered like constellations, her figure sculpted by corsets, her presence commanding. The lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and she sang. Her voice, deeper now, seasoned with age and smoke, carried not the playful seduction of youth, but the gravity of memory. Each note seemed drawn from a reservoir of experience, each pause weighted with unsaid truths. Audiences no longer expected her to embody youth. They came instead to witness the mystery of endurance, the strange beauty of one who defied the years by embracing their weight. And yet, behind the curtain, the mirror still fogged. She wiped it clean, saw the lines returning, saw the flesh soften, saw the truth that no surgery or costume could fully erase. Did she weep at such moments, or did she laugh, mocking time as she mocked convention? Perhaps she did both, for she was always a figure of contradiction, never yielding entirely to one truth or another. Her daughter, Maria, observed her closely in these years, noting both the magnificence and the fragility. Their relationship, strained and tender, revealed the cost of a life lived in performance. Maria saw the endless preparations, the discipline that bordered on obsession, the refusal to be seen without makeup, without the armor of glamour. For Marlene, the world could never glimpse her as ordinary. To appear ordinary would be to admit defeat, to surrender the illusion that had defined her. And so she fought on, her body reshaped, her image controlled, her voice adapted. But reinvention is wearying, and the cost of endless vigilance grows heavy. The applause sustained her, but applause fades quickly, leaving silence once more. And in that silence she faced the same truth all must face. That time cannot be defeated, only delayed. Still, one must ask, was her struggle vanity, or was it something deeper? Was it not perhaps an artist's refusal to surrender her art? For in her case, the art was herself. To let herself age unguarded might have felt like betraying her audience, betraying the myth they had embraced. She had given them an eternal figure of allure and mystery. To strip that away might have been a cruelty she could not bear to inflict. And so she bore the burden instead, carrying it alone, behind fogged mirrors and surgeons' knives. There is a poignancy in this defiance, a tragedy as well as a triumph. For what is gained when one conquers time in appearance, if only briefly, and what is lost when the effort itself consumes so much of one's strength? The mirror fogs again, and again she wipes it clear, searching for the face the world expects, erasing the face time offers. And so, in the quiet after the applause, she leaned closer to that mirror, breath fogging the glass once more, her hand lifting to wipe it away, her eyes searching not only for the reflection but for the self hidden within. The mirror clouded, cleared, clouded again, unresolved, as though refusing to answer the question of who she truly was. The mirror clouded and cleared, and with it came a sigh, soft at first, then heavier, as if it carried not only breath, but years of memory. From that sigh emerged the ghosts of lovers lost, those who had passed through her life like bright comets, dazzling the sky for a moment before vanishing into distance. For Marlene Dietrich, passion was never merely an ornament to life. It was its very pulse, its ceaseless current, its flame both sustaining and consuming. And yet, like all fire, it left behind ashes, reminders of what could not endure. She had given her heart freely, recklessly, often without calculation, for calculation was unnecessary when desire itself guided her steps. Among the most remembered of her lovers was Ernest Hemingway, that towering figure of American letters whose sentences cut with the sharpness of steel. Their connection was both intellectual and physical, threaded with admiration and laughter, yet also with an unspoken recognition that both were wanderers, restless souls who could not anchor themselves in ordinary life. Hemingway admired her courage, her defiance, her refusal to be tamed. She, in turn, admired his raw vitality, his ability to face danger and write of it without flinching. They circled one another for years, their letters carrying a mixture of tenderness and jest, of passion and irony, a dance never fully consummated in permanence, but always alive in suggestion. There was also Edith Piaf, the small sparrow of Paris whose voice trembled with sorrow and longing. Between Marlene and Edith, tenderness mingled with intensity. Two women who knew both the intoxication of the stage and the loneliness that followed. Their nights together were whispered of but rarely spoken aloud, for the world was not ready to see such loves clearly. Yet the truth of their intimacy lived in glances, in touches, in songs, sung for each other alone. To imagine Piaf's trembling voice beside Marlene's husky murmur is to glimpse the fragile thread that bound them, a thread woven of both fragility and fire. There were many others. Remarque, whose words had captured the futility of war, Yul Brynner with his striking presence, even whispers of affairs with the greats of stage and screen, some confirmed, others only imagined. Each carried something different into her life, a moment of warmth, of passion, of recognition, and yet none endured. For Marlene was always in motion, always caught between longing for closeness and fearing its permanence. To be tied too tightly was to risk losing herself, and so she moved on, leaving behind both tenderness and sorrow. Her daughter would later write of how these affairs wove through their lives like storms, unpredictable and consuming. For Marlene, passion was not hidden from her household. It was lived openly, if not always gently. The lovers came and went, and the child observed, perhaps bewildered, perhaps wounded, by the endless succession of intimacies. Yet Marlene herself seemed unable to live otherwise. To her, passion was not an indulgence but a necessity, as vital as breath, as integral to her identity as her voice on stage. But passion, though it nourishes, also devours. Each lover carried away a piece of her, and each departure left behind an emptiness that could not be filled. Did she know, as she sighed before her mirror, that her endless seeking was itself a kind of hunger that no single soul could satisfy? Did she long for a love that could endure, or did she fear it, knowing that permanence might strip away the mystery she so carefully cultivated? There is tragedy in such hunger, but also beauty. For in her loves, as in her songs, she embraced contradictions without apology, She could be tender one moment, cruel the next. She could laugh in intimacy and grow cold in distance. She could draw someone close only to push them away. To be loved by Marlene was to experience both ecstasy and despair, a reminder that passion is never safe, never secure, but always edged with risk. And yet, she remained unforgettable to those who touched her life. Hemingway, in his blunt yet tender way, spoke of her with admiration that lingered long after their paths diverged. Piaf remembered her as one who could make even silence feel charged with desire. Remarque found in her a muse who stirred his weary heart. Each left their mark upon her, and she upon them, a web of memory that stretched across decades. But at night, when the lovers had gone, when the laughter had faded, when she sat alone once more in her room, the ashtray filled with cigarette butts, the sigh returned. It carried with it not only memory, but a question. Why did passion always slip away? Why did closeness always dissolve into distance? The question remained unanswered as the fogging of the mirror, as unresolved as the sigh itself. And so, in those moments between lovers, between songs, between applause, she sat with the echo of her own breath, the soft whisper of loneliness that followed her even in the midst of abundance. The sigh drifted into the night, through a door left slightly ajar, its darkness waiting, unresolved. The door remained slightly ajar, the sigh of night slipping through its crack, and beyond it lay not the intimacy of lovers, but the relentless demand of the stage. For when passion faltered, when silence pressed too close, Marlene Dietrich returned again and again to performance, as though the act of singing beneath bright lights could hold back the shadows. The tours became her lifeblood in these middle years, stretching across continents, from the gilded concert halls of Paris to the wide stages of New York, from the glamour of London to the fevered adoration of Tokyo. Wherever she went, audiences flocked, eager to see not merely a woman, but the living embodiment of allure, the legend who had walked through exile and scandal, and yet still shimmered as if untouched. Her entrances were rituals, carefully designed. The curtain would rise, the lights would dim, and out of the darkness she would emerge, cloaked in gowns of sequins and silk, gowns that seemed to capture the very starlight and bend it around her body. She moved slowly, each gesture deliberate, each step a choreography of elegance. Silence spread across the hall, as though the audience held its breath until she chose to release it. And then, at last, her voice would rise, low, husky, weighted with smoke and years, imperfect in pitch, but perfect in presence. She did not need power. She needed only tone, for her voice was not music alone, but atmosphere, a spell cast over those who listened. She sang in many languages, shifting with ease from English to French to German, her accent itself a form of music, a reminder that she belonged nowhere and everywhere. Each song became a story, not acted but lived in the moment. Lili Marleen, La Vie en Rose, Falling in Love Again. These became more than melodies. They became threads in the fabric of her myth. Audiences leaned closer, not to admire technical mastery, but to bathe in the aura of mystery, the sensation of being in the presence of a woman who had survived the storms of the century and carried them still in her voice. The applause that followed was thunderous, waves crashing again and again, drawing her back to the stage for encore after encore. Flowers were thrown, voices shouted her name, men and women alike wept openly. In those moments she seemed untouchable, immortal, as though time itself had been suspended for her. Yet even as she bowed, even as she smiled faintly in acknowledgement, there was distance in her eyes. She gave herself to the stage, but never fully. She allowed the audience to believe they knew her, but she remained behind the veil, always withholding something essential. It was this withholding, this careful concealment that made her irresistible, for mystery is a rarer gift than beauty. But the tours were grueling. Night after night, city after city, the bright lamps burned hot. The gowns weighed heavy. The corsets cinched her body until breathing itself was labor. Behind the glamour lay exhaustion, the aching bones of a woman who pushed herself beyond endurance to maintain the myth. She rehearsed tirelessly, demanded perfection from her musicians, controlled every detail of the presentation. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was crafted. For she knew that to falter even once would be to reveal the frailty beneath the mask. And so she carried the burden of perfection upon her shoulders, smiling faintly while her body cried for rest. The rituals extended to her dressing rooms. Before each performance, she prepared with almost sacred precision, makeup applied layer upon layer, wigs adjusted, gowns fitted. Assistants hovered, responding to her commands with the nervous devotion of those who served both artist and myth. Mirrors reflected not only her face, but the effort of transformation, the daily resurrection of Dietrich the icon. By the time she stepped into the light, the woman had been concealed, and the legend had been reborn. Audiences adored her, yet they could not see the cost. They saw the shimmer, not the fatigue, the poised figure, not the trembling hands, the velvet voice, not the lungs, strained by years of smoke and endless nights. To them, she was eternal, the ageless goddess who gave of herself without limit, and perhaps she wished them to see only that, for she carried herself with dignity, never revealing the price behind the glamour. Still, there were nights when even she could not escape the weight. After the final curtain, after the flowers had been cleared and the dressing room emptied, she would sit alone, gown discarded across a chair, corset loosened, makeup half removed. The applause still echoed in her ears, but already it began to fade, leaving behind silence as deep as a chasm. She lit another cigarette, the smoke curling upward, and listened to the quiet that always followed triumph. Was it worth it? She must have wondered. To give so much, to drain oneself nightly, only to be left with exhaustion and solitude? Yet she returned, again and again. For the applause, though fleeting, was intoxicating. For the stage, though merciless, was the only place where she felt entirely alive. The tours became both her prison and her salvation, the rhythm by which she measured the passing years. Without them, she might dissolve into obscurity. With them, she remained radiant even as her body weakened. There is both beauty and tragedy in such devotion. To give oneself wholly to the stage is to ensure one's place in memory, yet it is also to live always at the edge of emptiness. For applause fades quickly, leaving only silence behind. And it was in that silence that she felt the ache most deeply, the reminder that admiration is not intimacy, that devotion of crowds cannot replace the closeness of one who stays when the curtain falls. The encore ended, the lights dimmed, the hall emptied, and the last echoes of clapping hands dissolved into night. In the hollow that remained, silence stretched wide, unresolved, as though waiting for her to fill it with another song she no longer had strength to sing. The silence after the applause stretched wide, an emptiness so complete it seemed to seep into her very bones. From that silence she withdrew, retreating step by step from the stage that had defined her, until at last the curtain did not rise again. The years of relentless touring had worn her down, the weight of gowns, the strain of corsets, the endless rhythm of hotels and stages had drained the strength that once sustained her. And so Marlene Dietrich slipped quietly into seclusion, choosing not the spotlight but the dim rooms of her Paris apartment, where curtains were drawn tightly against the world and the air grew heavy with time. The apartment became both refuge and prison. Situated in the 16th arrondissement, it was an address of elegance, yet within its walls the atmosphere was hushed, almost funereal. Daylight was unwelcome, and so the curtains remained closed, the rooms bathed in perpetual shadow. Furniture sat draped in silence, flowers withered quickly, and dust gathered slowly, unchallenged. For Marlene, this retreat was not merely preference but necessity. She could not bear the thought of being seen diminished, of allowing the world to glimpse the toll that time had taken on her body. Better to vanish into memory than to surrender her image to decay. The telephone became her last stage, the wire her invisible curtain. Friends, lovers, admirers called, and she spoke to them with the same husky wit she had once offered to audiences, weaving conversation into performance. On the line she remained ageless, her voice carrying the illusion of vitality, her phrases sharp with humor, her laughter still intoxicating. Those who spoke with her often forgot the years, forgot the reality of her frailty, for her voice alone conjured the Marlene they remembered. Yet beyond the telephone, the rooms remained silent, and the woman herself was rarely seen. Visitors were few and carefully chosen. Some who knocked at her door were turned away, others admitted only briefly, always under the shadow of her control. Photographs were forbidden, appearances avoided. For her, privacy was not only protection, but preservation. She had given her image to the world, and now she guarded what remained fiercely, unwilling to let time betray the legend she had so carefully sustained. The solitude was profound, days blurred into nights, weeks into years. She read voraciously, her apartment filled with books that became companions when human presence grew scarce. She wrote letters, sometimes long, sometimes curt, each bearing the imprint of her distinctive tone, equal parts warmth and irony. Yet isolation pressed heavily, for no voice can entirely replace touch, no letter entirely replace presence. Loneliness crept through the cracks of her carefully drawn curtains, and though she resisted, she could not fully keep it at bay. Her daughter, Maria, remained a tether, though their relationship carried its own wounds and tensions. Maria wrote candidly of her mother's contradictions, the star who dazzled the world yet struggled to offer tenderness at home, the woman who sought to control every image yet sometimes left those closest to her bewildered. Their bond endured, strained yet unbroken, but it was never the simple comfort of mother and child. In seclusion, Marlene reached out still, her telephone calls crossing the ocean to Maria's home in America, the two voices bridging distance even when hearts could not fully align. Meanwhile, the world outside her shuttered apartment moved on. New stars rose, fashions shifted, wars ended and began again, and the century turned toward its final decades. Yet within her rooms, time seemed suspended, as though she had chosen to live not in the present, but in memory. She listened to recordings of her own concerts, watched films of her younger self, revisited the myth she had created as though it were another companion in the dark. Did she take comfort in these echoes, or did they sharpen the pain of knowing that the figure on the screen, radiant and untouchable, was both herself and a stranger? Occasionally, news of her reached the world outside. A brief statement, a rumor, a whispered account of a friend who had spoken with her on the telephone. These fragments sustained the legend, ensuring that even in silence, she remained present in the imagination of her admirers. But the truth of her daily life, her frailty, her solitude, her rooms of shadow, remained hidden, known only to a few. In those years, the hum of the telephone line became the closest sound to applause, the faint buzz of connection carrying voices into her solitude. Yet, when the calls ended, when the receiver was set down, the hum lingered for a moment, low and unresolved, before dissolving back into silence. And so the apartment became her final stage, its curtains closed, its audience unseen, its only applause the faint hum of a disconnected line. The hum of the disconnected line lingered in the air, faint and stubborn, as if unwilling to vanish. And in that lingering hum lay the echo of another silence, one that had shadowed her life far longer, the silence between herself and her homeland. For though she had spoken to soldiers on foreign fields, though she had sung for audiences who adored her across the world, the wound of Germany's rejection never closed. It was not simply a matter of politics or exile. It was deeper, older, a tear in the fabric of belonging itself. The soil of her birth had turned its face from her, and though she had turned her back in defiance, the ache remained, unresolved. Berlin had once been her cradle, her proving ground, the city where she first pressed bow to violin string, where she first stepped onto stages shrouded in smoke and laughter. It was there she learned ambiguity. There she found her first voice. Yet when she chose to stand against the Nazis, when she chose exile in America, she severed herself from that soil, and Germany did not forgive her. To many of its citizens, she was traitor, deserter, a figure who mocked their suffering by singing for the enemy. They spat her name with bitterness, shouted insults when she returned, hissed in concert halls as though her voice itself had betrayed them. For years, this rejection festered. She bore it with her customary poise, lifting her chin as though unaffected, but behind the mask, the wound deepened. To be called traitor by strangers is one thing. To be rejected by one's homeland is another, heavier burden. The exile carries within them a divided heart, gratitude to the land that embraced them, sorrow for the land that cast them out. For Marlene, this sorrow was lifelong. She could not return to Berlin without controversy. She could not reconcile her choices with the bitterness of those who saw betrayal in them. And yet, even in her silence, one senses she longed for forgiveness, for a border that might open again, not in politics, but in memory. When she spoke of Germany in her later years, her words were sharp, laced with disdain. Yet beneath the disdain, one hears pain. Anger often hides longing, and perhaps she could not admit how deeply she yearned for the city that once shaped her. She declared herself American, proudly and with conviction, yet the German tongue still threaded her songs, still shaped her vowels, still carried her dreams. One cannot erase the sound of childhood from the voice, no matter how one tries. The wound deepened further when, in the post-war years, Germany began to rebuild its image, its streets, its sense of self. Other artists returned, were celebrated, were woven once more into the nation's fabric. But Marlene remained apart, her choices remembered not as courage, but as betrayal. When she performed in West Germany in the 1960s, the response was divided. Flowers on the stage, but also jeers, insults shouted into the darkness of the concert hall. Some wept at her voice, grateful for her return, while others shouted that she should never have come back. To stand on that stage must have been agony, the cheers and hisses colliding in a storm of sound that mirrored her own divided heart. She endured it, as she endured all things, with poise. But the bitterness remained. In her Paris apartment, when the curtains were closed and the world kept outside, perhaps her thoughts returned to Berlin, to streets she had not walked in decades, to memories of youth, to the possibility of reconciliation that never came. Did she dream of a moment when the border would open, not in politics but in spirit, when she could walk once more through the Brandenburg Gate as daughter rather than exile? Or did she resign herself to the role of outcast, finding strength in rejection, as she had found strength in scandal before? The truth, as always with her, remains ambiguous. She wore her bitterness like a cloak, yet cloaks conceal as much as they display. What lay beneath, only she knew, and she did not reveal it. The image remains. A closed border crossing, the gate barred, the road leading home blocked not by soldiers, but by memory itself. On one side stood Marlene, proud, distant, wrapped in sequins and solitude. On the other, a homeland unwilling to forgive, unable to forget. Between them lay silence, a silence heavier than words, heavier even than history. And in that silence she remained, neither fully here nor fully there, the exile who could never return, the daughter who was no longer claimed. The border stayed closed, unresolved, its gate unmoving as the years passed. The border remained closed, its gate unmoving, and in that immobility, another kind of stillness began to rise, not of soil and nation, but of celluloid and memory. For while Germany turned its back on her, the world still carried her within the reels of film, within the silver flicker of projectors that continued to cast her face upon screens long after she withdrew from the stage. There, in the fragile light of cinema, Marlene Dietrich became eternal, a figure frozen in time, her eyes forever narrowed, her lips forever curved in irony or invitation. And yet, like all images, the eternity was an illusion, fragile as dust, subject to the hum of machines that could stall at any moment. To sit in a darkened cinema years after her withdrawal was to encounter her anew. The screen trembled with light, and there she was, Lola Lola, Amy Jolly, Shanghai Lily, names given to her by scripts, but all carrying the same unmistakable essence. She might shift costume, accent, setting, but always the gaze remained, aloof and magnetic, pulling audiences toward her while never granting full entry. The power of her screen presence lay not in what she showed, but in what she withheld, the secrets kept behind her eyes. Even decades later, this power had not dimmed. Film critics spoke of her as a master of ambiguity, an actress who understood instinctively that cinema rewarded restraint. Where others exaggerated, she remained still, letting the camera search her face for meaning. In that stillness, viewers projected their own desires, their own fears, their own fantasies. She became a mirror as much as a figure, reflecting back whatever the audience longed to see. Perhaps this is why her image endured, not because it revealed truth, but because it invited endless interpretation. Yet there is something eerie in such endurance. To watch her younger self on screen, shimmering with vitality, while knowing that the woman behind the curtain in Paris sat aged and frail, was to feel the disjunction between image and reality. The real preserved her youth, but it also imprisoned her within it. Did she ever watch these films herself in later years? Did she press play on a projector, sit in the shadows of her apartment, and see herself as she once was? If so, what did she feel? Nostalgia, pride, sorrow, or perhaps nothing at all? Only she could know, and she did not tell. The collaboration with Sternberg remained central to this legacy. His lighting, his framing, his obsession with sculpting her into a vision of mystery ensured that her films with him became iconic, yet their partnership, like all human bonds, was not eternal. As they drifted apart, she continued to act, but the magic seemed altered. Later films offered glimpses of her brilliance, but never again the same alchemy that had marked the early 1930s. Still, those early works alone were enough to secure her place in cinema's memory. The projector flickered, its hum steady, until suddenly it stuttered, the film stalling, the image trembling upon the screen. In that trembling, one sees the fragility of memory itself. A reel can snap, a bulb can burn out, an archive can decay. What then becomes of eternity? If the machines fail, the image vanishes. And yet, even when the screen goes dark, her presence remains in the imagination, etched deeper than light itself. For her admirers, the films became relics, rituals of remembrance. To watch The Blue Angel was to return to the cabaret halls of Weimar decadence, to see again the feather drifting down. To watch Morocco was to feel once more the shock of her tuxedoed kiss, the boundary crossed without apology. To watch Shanghai Express was to hear her voice speak of fate with the calm of one who had lived too much to fear it. These films, endlessly revisited, allowed her to live on in fragments, shimmering fragments detached from the aging body hidden in Paris. But fragments cannot hold the whole. The real woman, the exile, the mother, the solitary figure who sat by her telephone, was absent from these reels. They showed only the myth, never the loneliness, only the mask, never the sigh behind it. And yet, perhaps this was precisely how she wished it. For Marlene understood better than most that art does not reveal truth, but transforms it, reshapes it into something greater than the life beneath. Her films were not lies, but illusions, illusions that carried truths too elusive for words. And so, as projectors stalled, as reels aged, as audiences shifted from cinemas to television screens, her image remained, flickering still. Each new generation discovered her, marveling at the strange figure who seemed both woman and apparition, both timeless and impossibly of her time. Some admired her glamour, others her defiance, still others her mystery. All were drawn, each in their own way, to the light she carried. The projector's flicker dimmed, the image trembled, then froze for an instant. Her face caught mid-gaze, lips parted as though about to speak, eyes unreadable. And then the reel stuttered to a halt, the screen gone blank, leaving only the faint smell of overheated celluloid, the memory of her frozen expression lingering in the dark, unresolved. The projector stalled, her image frozen in mid-gaze, lips parted as if to speak a truth she never would. And in the silence that followed, another image began to form, not of the star upon the screen, but of the woman behind closed doors, the mother whose life was not entirely her own. For even in the midst of sequins, applause, and scandal, Marlene Dietrich was bound by a quieter role, one less visible, but no less consuming, that of mother to her daughter, Maria. And yet, as with so many things in her life, the bond was marked not by simplicity, but by contradiction, a thread of tenderness woven through with strands of distance and silence. Maria Riva grew up in the long shadow of her mother's myth. To be a child in the orbit of Marlene Dietrich was to live both close to glamour and estranged from it. The household was filled with costumes, wigs, gowns shimmering like constellations, and yet behind the shimmer there was discipline bordering on severity. Marlene demanded perfection not only of herself, but of those around her, including her daughter. Appearances mattered. Order mattered. The construction of image mattered above all. Maria recalled later how her mother insisted on meticulousness in every detail of daily life, how the furniture was arranged, how meals were served, how she herself presented before others. Childhood in such an environment was not innocent play, but performance. And yet, despite this rigor, Maria remained close to her mother, bound by a complicated love. She saw the vulnerability behind the facade, the exhaustion after concerts, the sighs before the mirror, the loneliness masked by cigarettes and laughter. To the world, Marlene was an untouchable goddess. To Maria, she was both dazzling and fragile, a figure to be admired, feared, pitied, and loved all at once. Their bond endured, but it was not free of wounds. As Maria grew older, she began to understand that her mother's lovers, her scandals, her relentless pursuit of reinvention were not merely indulgences, but necessities for survival. Yet this understanding did not erase the pain of absence, the nights when Marlene was away on tour, the days when her attention was divided by affairs and performance. Maria became, in many ways, both daughter and witness, recording in memory the contradictions of her mother's life. Later, she would set them down in writing, a testimony both affectionate and critical, an attempt to make sense of the myth and the woman behind it. For Marlene, motherhood was not an identity she wore comfortably. She loved Maria, yet she could not shed the armor of performance even in her presence. She could comfort, but she could also command. She could offer laughter, but she could also withhold warmth. Was it fear of vulnerability? The same fear that kept her from showing the world her unguarded self? Or was it simply the consequence of a life lived always in public, always under scrutiny, until even private rooms became stages? The question lingers, as unresolved as so many in her story. Their relationship was not only tension, but tenderness too. There were moments of shared intimacy, quiet meals, private jokes, stories whispered at night. Maria remembered her mother's sudden bursts of humor, her capacity to charm not only audiences, but the very air of a room. She remembered the strength with which Marlene faced exile, the courage with which she defied tyranny. She carried pride in her mother's defiance, even when it left wounds within their home. And in return, Marlene depended upon Maria more than she often admitted. In later years, when seclusion became her chosen refuge, it was Maria who remained her most steadfast connection, the voice across the ocean, the bond that tethered her to the world. Yet even in this bond there was distance. The mother who lived for performance could not wholly belong to her child. The star consumed the woman, and the woman consumed the mother. Maria grew to accept this, though never without sorrow. In her memoirs, she captured both the magnificence and the pain, painting a portrait that was neither idle nor condemnation, but a complex truth. For in speaking of her mother, she sought not to destroy the myth, but to reveal the human heart that beat beneath its glittering surface. The frozen image of the projector, lips parted in silence, becomes almost symbolic of this relationship. Marlene remained always partly inaccessible, even to her daughter. She revealed much, but never all. She gave, but always withheld something essential. Maria, watching her mother upon the screen, must have felt both pride and estrangement, knowing that the woman immortalized there was hers, and yet not hers, mother and stranger entwined. In the silence of the Paris apartment, as years slipped by and curtains stayed drawn, the bond endured still. Telephone calls bridged oceans, words were exchanged, love, though strained, was present. But it was never the simple love of mother and daughter walking side by side in the open sun. It was love shadowed by distance, by myth, by the glittering armor that never fully came off. And so, from the frozen reel of the projector, we hear another sound, the faint, lingering echo of a child's cry, not in anger, not in joy, but in the timeless ache of longing for a closeness that could never fully be given. The cry reverberates through the silence, unresolved, as though still waiting to be answered. The cry of the child echoed, faint and unresolved, and from that echo emerged another chorus of voices, not of infants, but of artists, writers, directors, men and women whose pens and cameras and brushes sought to capture the enigma of Marlene Dietrich. For if she was elusive to her daughter, she was no less elusive to her friends, and yet they pursued her endlessly, compelled to set her image into words, into film, into lines upon paper that might outlast the fleeting moment. She became not only performer, but muse, her presence shaping the work of others as much as it shaped her own. Jean Cocteau once wrote of her as though she were both angel and phantom, a being who walked in daylight yet seemed born of shadows. To him, she embodied the contradiction of beauty and strangeness, a vision not quite human but not divine either, suspended between the two. For Billy Wilder, who admired her keen intelligence and sharp wit, she was proof that glamour need not be hollow, that beneath the sequins and gowns lay a mind as incisive as any satirist's blade. For Ernest Hemingway, she was both companion and challenge, a woman whose refusal to yield kept him returning, pen in hand, again and again. And yet, for every artist who sought to fix her in words or images, there was always something that escaped. She was not a subject to be captured, but a mirror in which their own longings reflected. To Cocteau, she was a dream, to Wilder, a symbol of wit, to Hemingway, a sparring partner in life's game of courage and desire. Each found what they sought in her, and yet none could claim her fully. Perhaps this was her truest gift as muse, not to be defined, but to evoke, to spark creation by her very elusiveness. Marlene herself cultivated these friendships with the same mixture of generosity and control that marked her performances. She could be dazzling in conversation, her voice laced with irony, her laughter sharp and sudden. She could also be guarded, withdrawing behind a mask of indifference. To her friends, she offered both intimacy and distance, feeding their admiration while keeping her true self veiled. She seemed to understand instinctively that the power of a muse lay not in surrender, but in refusal, not in giving everything, but in withholding just enough to keep desire alive. Her correspondence with these figures remains a testament to the complexity of her role. Letters filled with wit, with flirtation, with sudden turns of tenderness, survive as fragments of a dialogue that never ended. In them, she reveals both warmth and calculation, a woman who knew the effect of her words and used them as carefully as she once used the tilt of her chin beneath studio lamps. Each sentence could charm, disarm, or provoke. Each letter was both communication and performance, the line between the two erased. The friendships lasted decades, some fading, others renewed. Wilder spoke of her long after her seclusion, recalling the brilliance of her mind. Hemingway carried her memory until his final days, though their bond was never easy. Cocteau, ever the poet, insisted that she remained a figure beyond time. To inspire such men was no small feat, but for Marlene it seemed effortless, as though her very existence was a poem waiting to be written. And yet one must wonder, did she find in these friendships the closeness denied her in love, or were they simply another stage, another form of performance? Did she value them for the reflection they cast back upon her, or for the solace they provided in her solitude? Perhaps both. For she was never wholly one thing. She was muse and woman, friend and enigma, giver and withholder. To demand clarity is to misunderstand her. To accept ambiguity is to glimpse her truth. There is a certain sadness in being muse, however. To be the source of another's creation is to be both exalted and objectified, both admired and consumed. The artist sees, but sees only through their own desire. The muse remains partly unseen, her own voice subsumed in the echo of another's pen. Marlene, who lived her life in masks and mirrors, must have known this intimately. Perhaps she even welcomed it, finding in the incompleteness a kind of protection. For if no one could fully capture her, then no one could fully own her. Still, the image of the pen remains. Friends and lovers alike wrote of her, their words scattered across pages, some published, others left hidden in drawers. In those pages, one feels the urgency to preserve her, to hold on to the fleeting spark she carried. But pens falter, sentences trail off, and always something is left unsaid. To write of Marlene Dietrich was to write into silence, to leave a sentence unfinished, as though language itself could not contain her. And so the pen scratches across paper, halts, hovers mid-sentence. The ink dries at the tip, unresolved, as if waiting for a word that will never come, a truth that cannot be written. The pen hovered mid-sentence, its ink drying on the tip, and in that silence another script emerged, not of lovers or friends, but of conviction and politics, the choices she made that could not be erased with charm or forgotten with laughter. For Marlene Dietrich was not only muse and performer, she was a woman of decisions that bound her for life. Her anti-fascism was not vague gesture, but fierce defiance, a stand taken when neutrality might have preserved her comfort. And though the world celebrated her for it, though she was decorated with medals of honor, the cost of this stand was exile, estrangement, the never-ending complexity of belonging nowhere fully, of always standing slightly apart. From the very moment she rejected the Nazi regime, her life was marked by politics, whether she willed it or not. She might have returned to Germany in the 1930s, embraced by the new rulers, raised as a figure of national pride, showered with honors. Many urged her to do so. The propaganda machine desired her beauty, her fame, her magnetism. But she refused. Instead, she chose the United States and later France as her allegiances. To refuse was already rebellion. To take up the Allied cause was outright defiance. And so she sang for soldiers, not merely out of charity, but as a weapon of spirit. Her presence at the front was political theater as much as morale. Each note sung in English or French, each smile given to Allied soldiers, was an act of resistance against the regime that claimed to speak for her homeland. She was no soldier with a rifle, but she understood that voices, too, could be weapons. That song itself could wound tyranny by sustaining those who opposed it. When the war ended, her convictions did not soften. She spoke openly against the horrors committed in Germany, refusing to excuse or diminish. She aligned herself with those who believed that truth must be faced, no matter how painful. For this, she was honored abroad. The French government awarded her the Légion d'honneur. America bestowed the Medal of Freedom, symbols of gratitude for a courage that required no battlefield. She accepted them with grace, her poise unbroken, yet perhaps beneath the surface, she understood that each medal weighed heavily, for each confirmed her distance from the land that had given her birth. Her politics were not only against fascism, but for freedom in its broadest sense. She lived her life as an assertion that boundaries of gender, of desire, of nationality could be crossed or dissolved. To wear trousers on stage, to kiss another woman before the gaze of the camera, to speak out against tyranny, to reject the comfort of silence. All these were political acts, even if she framed them as personal choices. She seemed to understand that to live authentically in defiance of expectation was itself a form of resistance, and yet exile was the shadow beneath her defiance. To stand apart from Germany was to lose the possibility of reconciliation, to live always as guest in foreign lands. America welcomed her, celebrated her, but she was never entirely American. France adored her, but she was never entirely French. She sang in many tongues, but each reminded her of what she had lost. She lived in apartments filled with books and memories, but never with the rootedness of belonging. Exile gave her freedom, but it also denied her home. The complexity of this life weighed on her in later years. She spoke of Germany with bitterness, yet bitterness is only the other side of longing. If she truly felt nothing for her homeland, she would not have spoken of it at all. Instead, she spoke often, sharply, refusing to forgive but unable to forget. Perhaps she longed for forgiveness herself, though she would never confess it aloud. Perhaps she wished for Germany to see her choices not as betrayal but as loyalty of another kind, the loyalty of refusing to serve tyranny. But history rarely grants such subtleties. Nations remember in simpler terms, traitor or patriot, daughter or exile. This division mirrored her own inner contradictions. Just as she was both tender and cruel in love, Both generous and aloof in friendship, so too was she both proud and wounded in exile. To live in contradiction was her way, and in that way she carried the burden of politics without flinching. But the burden did not vanish. It remained, pressing upon her, heavy as the medals she received, silent as the distance she kept from her homeland. What is the cost of conviction? Is it the applause of strangers or the rejection of one's own people? Is it the pride of knowing one has stood against tyranny or the loneliness of being forever cut off from home? For Marlene, it was all these at once. She bore them with dignity, yet in the solitude of her Paris apartment, one imagines her turning the question over again and again without answer. Among her books lay histories and letters, volumes that traced the same era she had lived. Perhaps she read them at night, curtains drawn, cigarette smoke curling, eyes scanning the lines of others' accounts of war and exile. Did she search for herself in those pages, for some mention that would explain her place? Or did she set them aside, knowing that no writer could capture the contradictions she embodied? And so, the pen that once hovered mid-sentence becomes a page, turned carefully, its lines waiting. But sometimes she closed the book before finishing, leaving the page unread, as though unwilling to know how the story would end. The page remained, heavy with words, yet unseen, unresolved, waiting for eyes that would never return to it. The page lay unread, its words waiting, and in that gesture of refusal, of leaving sentences unseen, there was already the shadow of her final years. For Marlene Dietrich, who had lived through stages and wars, who had given herself to audiences and lovers and causes, now found herself withdrawing more deeply than ever, until at last her world was reduced to the confines of a single room. The Paris apartment, once only refuge and fortress, became her last dwelling, the place where she spent over a decade bedridden, unseen, the curtains drawn against the city beyond. Illness and age had claimed her body, though her will remained sharp, her mind restless. She suffered from injuries sustained during her grueling touring years, ailments worsened by time and the strain she had long ignored. Walking became painful, then impossible. The legs that had once carried her in shimmering gowns across stages now held her no more, and so she retreated into her bed, into the shadows of her room, where light was dim and silence thick. For the woman who had fought so fiercely to control her image, to preserve her allure, to defy time itself, this seclusion was perhaps the only choice left, to disappear before the world could witness her diminished. The curtains were heavy, always drawn, shutting out the light of Paris. Outside, the city hummed with life. Cars upon boulevards, lovers walking arm in arm, laughter spilling from cafes. But within her apartment, the air was hushed, timeless. Days and nights blurred, distinguished only by the ringing of the telephone or the soft steps of attendants. Her voice, still rich though frailer, carried across the wires to those she chose to speak with. For her telephone became her stage now, her words the performance. She charmed, complained, joked, commanded. Friends who called sometimes forgot she was bedridden. So lively was her wit, so quick her tongue. Yet when the receiver was set down, silence descended once more, a silence that no applause could break. She read still. When her eyes allowed, her apartment lined with books that offered companionship in solitude. Histories, novels, letters. She devoured them, seeking in others' words what she herself could no longer enact. She wrote letters too, her pen still sharp, her sentences precise, her tone unmistakably hers. Those who received them felt her presence in ink, felt the authority and elegance that had marked her speech in life. Even from her bed, she maintained control, shaping her narrative, refusing to be diminished by circumstance. Yet the truth of her existence was lonely. Few visitors were admitted. Fewer still were welcomed warmly. She guarded her privacy as fiercely as she once guarded her image. To be seen frail, unadorned, dependent, this was intolerable to her. Better to vanish than to allow the myth to crumble. And so she vanished, though her body remained, hidden behind the curtains, hidden from the city that pulsed beyond her walls. The years passed this way, each day resembling the last. The woman who had once commanded armies of admirers now depended upon attendance for the simplest tasks. The woman who had once glittered in sequins and feathers now lay in nightgowns, her costumes packed away, her gowns slumbering in trunks. The applause was memory only, faint and distant, echoing in her mind like a dream she could not quite touch. Did she regret, in those final years, the path she had chosen? Did she long to step once more into light, to feel the warmth of lamps upon her face, to hear applause thunder in her ears? Or did she find a strange peace in silence, a final liberation from the endless demands of performance? Perhaps both, for she was always both things at once, contradiction embodied, never allowing a single truth to define her. Outside, the world changed. New stars rose, new scandals occupied headlines, new wars reshaped nations. Yet still her name lingered, her films played, her songs remembered. Admirers wrote, sent flowers, whispered of her even when she remained unseen. The myth persisted, even as the woman behind it withered. And perhaps this was her greatest triumph, that even in frailty, even in seclusion, she controlled her legacy by withdrawing from view. The image of the heavy curtains becomes central here. Each morning they remained drawn, each evening they remained shut, sealing her within shadows. They were both protection and symbol, shielding her from eyes she no longer wished upon her, marking the divide between the myth the world remembered and the body she had become. The curtains were her final collaborators, preserving her mystery until the end. And so, in those last years, Marlene Dietrich lived not in light but in shadow, not in applause but in silence, not in presence but in memory. The telephone hummed, the letters carried her voice, but the woman herself remained hidden, her body failing, her spirit still fierce, her legacy still untouchable. At last, the curtains grew heavier still, as though time itself pressed upon their fabric. And one imagines their slow closing, the final dimming of light within the room, the world outside continuing, unaware, while inside, silence deepened into permanence. The curtains closed slowly, heavy fabric falling against itself, dimming the room into a twilight that no lamp could fully break. Within this enclosed silence, Marlene Dietrich passed her final years, until at last the moment came when even the telephone ceased to ring, even the attendant stepped softly in reverence, and she was gone. It was May 1992, in Paris, the city that had sheltered her exile, the city where she had chosen seclusion over exposure. She died as she had lived in her final decades, behind drawn curtains, unseen, her body retreating into stillness while the world outside continued in its restless rhythm. News of her death spread across continents like a whisper. Newspapers carried her name once more upon their front pages, photographs from decades earlier suddenly alive again, reminders of the woman who had once commanded the gaze of millions. Yet the woman herself was already silent, already beyond the reach of flashbulbs and applause. Her funeral, though dignified, carried its own contradictions. Paris honored her with solemnity, the tricolor flag draping her coffin, acknowledging her as one of its adopted heroines. Yet when her remains were returned to Berlin, it was to a homeland still uncertain how to claim her. Some wept openly, at last willing to forgive the exile who had chosen defiance over obedience. Others muttered still of betrayal, their bitterness not softened by death. She was laid to rest in the city of her birth, yet even in burial she did not wholly belong. The soil that received her carried both pride and reproach, both longing and resentment. The exile was returned, but not reconciled. And yet, perhaps, this was fitting. For Marlene Dietrich had always lived between categories, never wholly one thing or another, never fully embraced, nor fully cast out. In life she was scandalous and revered, lonely and adored, mocking and tender. Why should death resolve what life never could? Her grave, simple, marked her name without extravagance, as though even in memory she resisted conclusion. Visitors come still, leaving flowers, whispers, silent gestures of devotion. Some linger with admiration, others with curiosity, but all feel the presence of a woman who remains elusive even in stone. Her legacy endures less in marble than in film and song. Each time the blue angel flickers upon a screen, Lola Lola lives again. Perched upon her barrel, stockings gleaming, feathered hat tilted, voice curling through the smoke. Each time, Falling in Love Again plays, audiences are transported to a moment when irony and desire mingled in her gaze. Each time photographs of her in tuxedo and cigarette resurface, they remind the world that boundaries of gender and identity were crossed long before they were spoken of openly. She lingers not only as actress or singer, but as symbol of freedom, of ambiguity, of defiance. And yet, beneath the symbols lies the sorrow of her solitude. She lived boldly, yes, but she died alone, her curtains drawn, her telephone silent, her body frail. The cost of her myth was heavy, and she bore it until the end. Was it worth it? Did she, in her final moments, feel triumph for the life she had carved, or did she feel regret for the intimacy she had lost? The answer, like so much of her life, remains cloaked in mystery. Perhaps the question itself matters more than the answer, for her power was always in ambiguity, in leaving us wondering, never fully knowing. One imagines, in those final breaths, the echo of songs sung long ago. Perhaps she heard in her mind the refrain of Lili Marleen, that melody of longing carried across battlefields. Perhaps she heard the laughter of cabarets in Weimar Berlin, the applause of Hollywood studios, the cheers and jeers of post-war Germany. Or perhaps she heard nothing but silence, a silence deeper than any applause, a silence that closed around her like the curtains she had drawn for so many years. And yet, silence is never final. In memory, she lingers. In celluloid, she flickers. In recordings, she sings still, her voice husky, ironic, tender, mocking, always unresolved. The world continues to ask who she was, lover or loner, heroine or traitor, goddess or exile, and the world continues to find no answer, only the shifting of shadows where her gaze once fell. The curtains closed, yes, but behind them remains a glow, faint, persistent, as if the stage light were never entirely extinguished. The feather drifts once more, the tuxedo gleams again, the cigarette burns faintly in its ashtray. Lola Lola laughs, Marlene Dietrich sighs, and the images overlap until one cannot tell where the role ends and the woman begins. She remains both, and neither, a figure of allure and sorrow, a fallen angel whose wings were stitched from sequins and silence. And so the story returns to its beginning, the barrel on stage, the laughter of a cabaret, the gaze that could undo a man or a nation. The circle closes, but not with conclusion, only with continuation, for memory never ends. Her voice lingers in the air, hushed, mocking, tender, unresolved. And then at last, silence.